There's different kinds of wealth in this world, friend. There's the kind that comes with your name on a bank ledger, and there's the kind that comes from earning your place under the big sky with calloused hands and a willing heart. I've seen both kinds, and I'll tell you straight, the second one's worth more than all the gold in California. This here's a story about what happens when a woman raised on silk and silver decides to trade it all for sagebrush and honesty. It's about learning that the richest person in the valley might not be the one with the biggest house, but the one with the biggest heart. And sometimes, just sometimes, love asks you to choose between everything you've known and everything you could become. So settle in close, because the storm's picking up outside, and what I'm about to tell you happened when Wyoming Territory was still wild, and the only law that mattered was the law a person carried in their chest. Katherine Sinclair had been running for 3 days when the Wyoming storm caught her stagecoach like a cat catching a mouse. She pressed her face to the rain-streaked window, watching the landscape blur past in sheets of grey water and wind, and wondered if fleeing her father's mansion in New York had been the smartest thing she'd ever done, or the most foolish. At 24, Katherine was everything a banker's daughter was supposed to be: educated, refined, accomplished in all the social graces that mattered to New York society. She could speak French and play piano, discuss literature and manage a household staff. What she couldn't do was marry Reginald Pemberton III, the pale, pompous son of her father's business partner, no matter how much it would benefit the family's financial empire. "You'll marry him and be grateful for it," her father had thundered when she'd refused the match for the 3rd time. "Ungrateful girl, you have no idea how the world works beyond your drawing room fantasies." But Katherine had ideas about how the world could work. Ideas that didn't involve becoming a decorative wife to a man who collected women like he collected hunting trophies. She'd heard stories about the West, about places where a person could reinvent themselves, where worth was measured by character instead of bloodline. So she'd taken what money she could carry, left a letter explaining her decision, and bought passage on the first train heading west. She hadn't planned on the stagecoach ride from Cheyenne to smaller towns being quite so adventurous. The crash happened just after sunset, when the driver lost control on a muddy switchback. Katherine found herself tumbling through darkness and splintering wood, her traveling dress torn and her carefully arranged hair coming loose from its pins. When the world stopped spinning, she was lying in the mud beside an overturned coach, rain soaking through her clothes and the taste of blood in her mouth. The driver, old Pete Kowalski, was conscious but favoring his left arm. The other passenger, a drummer selling patent medicines, was unconscious but breathing. Katherine tried to stand and found her ankle couldn't bear weight, not broken, but twisted enough to make walking difficult. That's when she heard the sound of horses approaching through the storm. "Hello, the coach," came a voice that cut through the wind and rain like a blade. "Anyone hurt?" Katherine looked up through her rain-soaked hair to see a man dismounting from a large bay horse. He was tall and lean, built like someone who'd spent his life working outdoors, with dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. His clothes were practical: denim pants, a wool coat, boots that had seen honest wear, but everything about him spoke of competence and quiet authority. "Driver's got a busted arm," Katherine called back, pushing wet strands of hair from her face. "Other passengers unconscious. I think my ankle's twisted." The stranger was already moving, checking on Pete first, then the unconscious drummer, his hands gentle but sure as he examined injuries. When he turned his attention to Katherine, she found herself looking into the most honest eyes she'd ever seen, grey as storm clouds, but warm with genuine concern. "Name's Luke Harper," he said, kneeling beside her in the mud without any regard for his own clothes. "I run a spread about 5 miles north. Let me take a look at that ankle." His touch was careful, professional, the hands of someone who'd dealt with injuries before. "Not broken," he pronounced, "but you won't be walking on it for a few days." Katherine realized she was staring at him, at the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar, at the small scar above his left eyebrow, at the easy confidence with which he took charge of the situation. This wasn't like any man she'd known in New York, where strength was measured in bank accounts and influence was purchased with family connections. "What's your name, miss?" Luke asked. Katherine hesitated for just a moment. Katherine Sinclair would mean questions, investigations, telegrams back east. But here in the mud and rain, she could be anyone she chose to be. "Kate," she said. Kate Sullivan, the name of her Irish grandmother, the one family rebel her father had always tried to forget. Luke nodded, accepting the name without question. "Well, Kate Sullivan, we need to get you folks out of this weather. My ranch isn't fancy, but it's dry and warm. Pete, can you ride if I get you up on a horse?" What followed was a careful, slow journey through the storm to the Harper Ranch. Kate rode behind Luke on his bay, trying not to think about how solid and reassuring he felt, how his presence made her feel safer than she'd felt since leaving New York. The Harper Ranch was modest but well-maintained, a two-story house, a large barn, corrals that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. Luke helped her down from the horse with the same careful gentleness he'd shown at the crash site, then carried her into the house despite her protests that she could manage. "Mrs. Chen," he called as they entered, "we've got injured folks need tending." An elderly Chinese woman emerged from what appeared to be the kitchen, took one look at the muddy, bedraggled group, and immediately began issuing orders in a mixture of English and what Katherine assumed was Mandarin. Within minutes, Katherine found herself in a clean, simply furnished guest room, with Mrs. Chen bustling around gathering medical supplies and dry clothes. "You rest," Mrs. Chen said firmly, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. "Mr. Luke, he good man, take care of you proper." As Katherine lay in the narrow bed, wearing a borrowed nightgown that smelled of lavender and listening to the storm rage outside, she realized something had changed in the past few hours. For the first time in her life, she was somewhere her father's name and money couldn't reach, dependent on the kindness of strangers who knew nothing about her background and cared only about doing what was right. It was terrifying, and it was wonderful. Katherine Kate stayed at the Harper Ranch for 2 weeks while her ankle healed, and in those 2 weeks she learned more about herself than she had in 24 years of privileged living. She also learned about Luke Harper, the man who'd rescued her from that overturned stagecoach, and without knowing it, from the life she'd been trying to escape. Luke had been born poor, on a hard-scrabble farm in Texas. His father had died when Luke was 12, leaving him to care for his mother and 2 younger sisters. He'd worked as a cowhand, a trail boss, and eventually saved enough to buy his own small spread in Wyoming. Through 15 years of careful management, fair dealing, and the kind of bone-deep honesty that made other ranchers trust him with their cattle and their word, he'd built the Harper Ranch into one of the most respected operations in the territory. He was also, Katherine realized with growing certainty, the finest man she'd ever met. "You planning to head back east once that ankle's sound?" Luke asked one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Katherine, she was thinking of herself as Kate now, even in her own mind considered the question. She'd been sending letters to various towns, inquiring about positions as a governess or school teacher, anything that would let her stay in Wyoming and build a life that was truly her own. "I don't think so," she said carefully. "There's nothing for me back there. I was hoping to find work out here, maybe as a teacher." Luke was quiet for a moment, his coffee cup balanced on his knee. "Kate, if you don't mind me asking, what exactly are you running from? Because a woman with your education, your way of speaking, you didn't grow up on a farm." Katherine felt her heart skip. She'd been so careful, but Luke was observant, and she'd let her guard down more than once, forgetting to hide her knowledge of literature, her familiarity with business principles, her unconscious expectation that others would defer to her wishes. "Nothing criminal," she said finally, "just expectations I couldn't live up to, people who wanted me to be someone I'm not." Luke nodded slowly. "I can understand that. Sometimes a person has to travel a fair distance to find out who they really are." The next morning, Luke made her an offer that took her completely by surprise. "Kate, I've been thinking, I could use help around here, someone who can read and write well, help with the books, maybe teach some of the Hans children their letters. It wouldn't pay much, but you'd have a roof over your head and honest work. If you're serious about staying in Wyoming." Katherine stared at him, her heart hammering. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a chance to prove you belong out here," Luke said simply, "if that's what you want." What Katherine wanted, she realized with startling clarity, was to never leave this place, these people, this man who saw something worthwhile in a woman calling herself Kate Sullivan. But what she said was, "I'd be grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Harper." What followed were the hardest and most satisfying months of Katherine's life. She learned to keep ranch accounts, to tend sick cattle, to cook for a crew of hungry cowhands. Her soft hands developed calluses, her pale skin tanned from long days outdoors, and her body grew strong from work she'd never imagined doing. More importantly, she earned Luke's respect. She saw it in the way he began to ask her opinion on ranch decisions, the way he trusted her with increasingly important responsibilities, the way his eyes would soften when he looked at her across the dinner table. And she fell in love with him completely, hopelessly, with the kind of love that changes everything about who you thought you were. Luke was falling too, though he fought it harder than she did. Kate Sullivan was unlike any woman he'd known, educated enough to discuss books and politics, but willing to roll up her sleeves and work alongside the men when calving season came. She was beautiful, but not in the fragile way of Eastern ladies. This was beauty tempered by strength, softness balanced by determination. The crisis came in late spring, when Katherine had been at the ranch for nearly 6 months and had almost convinced herself that Kate Sullivan could have a real future with Luke Harper. She was in the ranch office, working on the quarterly accounts, when she heard the sound of several horses approaching fast. Through the window, she saw a sight that made her blood turn to ice water. 4 men in expensive suits riding toward the house, led by James Brennan, her father's chief investigator. Katherine had just enough time to step away from the desk and smooth her hair before Luke came through the door, his face grim. "Kate, there's some men here to see you. Say they're from New York. Say they've been looking for you for months." Katherine's throat went dry. "Luke, I can explain." But it was too late. James Brennan was already pushing past Luke into the office, his cold eyes taking in Katherine's simple dress, her tanned hands, her hair pulled back in a practical bun instead of an elaborate arrangement. "Miss Katherine Sinclair," he said formally, "your father has been very worried about you." The silence that followed was so complete, Katherine could hear her own heartbeat. She looked at Luke and saw the exact moment when understanding and betrayal dawned in his storm-grey eyes. "Katherine Sinclair," he repeated slowly, "as in Sinclair Banking and Investment, as in one of the richest families in New York." Katherine lifted her chin, finding her voice at last. "Luke, let me explain." "Explain what?" His voice was quiet, but she could hear the anger underneath. "Explain how you've been lying to me for 6 months. Explain how you've been playing at being poor while your family owns half of Wall Street." "It wasn't like that," Katherine said desperately. "I never meant to lie. I wanted to be someone else, someone real." Luke's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Someone real? Lady, you wouldn't know real if it bit you on your pampered behind. You want to play at being a ranch hand. That's fine. But when playtime's over, you go back to your father's mansion, and your servants, and your life of luxury, and us working folks get back to the business of actually living." Brennan stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Sinclair, your father is prepared to be generous about this episode. He's arranged for your engagement to Mr. Pemberton to proceed as planned. The wedding will be in September." Katherine looked around the office that had become more home to her than any mansion, at the simple furniture, the ranch accounts she'd learned to manage, the view of the mountains through the window, Then she looked at Luke standing there with his heart breaking and his pride wounded, and realized she had one chance to prove that Kate Sullivan wasn't just a game she'd been playing. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice steady as mountain stone, "you can tell my father that Katherine Sinclair is dead. She died in a stagecoach accident 6 months ago. There's only Kate Sullivan now, and she's not going anywhere." What followed was the kind of fight that would be talked about in Wyoming Territory for years to come. Not a physical fight, though Luke had to be restrained from throwing James Brennan off the property, but a battle of wills that would determine whether money and family expectations could triumph over love and personal choice. Brennan played his strongest cards first. Katherine's father was prepared to disinherit her completely if she didn't return. She would lose access to the family fortune, to the social position she'd been born to everything that had defined her life for 24 years. "You'll be penniless," Brennan warned. "Do you have any idea what that means? Do you know what it's like to be poor?" Katherine looked around at the ranch that had become her home, at the work-worn hands that had never felt more capable, at the man who'd taught her that wealth could be measured in sunsets and honest labor, and the respect of people who valued character over cash. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly, "I've been rich and I've been poor. Rich is better, but not if it costs you your soul." But Luke wasn't ready to forgive, and Katherine couldn't blame him. The wound of discovering she'd been lying, even if the lie had started as self-protection, went deep. He avoided her for days, conducting ranch business through Mrs. Chen, or one of the hands, treating her with the kind of cold politeness reserved for unwelcome strangers. Katherine might have given up then, might have accepted that she'd lost her chance at happiness through her own deception. But 6 months of ranch life had changed her in ways that went deeper than calloused hands and suntanned skin. She'd learned that worth was something you earned, not something you inherited. So she did something that would have been unthinkable for the Katherine Sinclair who'd fled New York. She fought for what she wanted. She continued working, taking on every difficult, dirty, dangerous job the ranch offered. When a late-season blizzard threatened the cattle, she was out in the snow with the rest of the hands, helping to drive the herd to shelter. When rustlers struck at a neighboring ranch, she rode with Luke and the sheriff's posse, proving she could sit a horse and handle a rifle as well as any man. Most importantly, she proved she could make the hardest choice of all. When the papers arrived from New York, official documents that would transfer her inheritance to a trust fund, effectively cutting her off from the family fortune forever, Katherine signed them without hesitation in front of Luke and half the territory's leading citizens. "Kate Sullivan doesn't need Sinclair money," she said simply. "She'll make her own way." That night, Luke finally came to talk to her. She was sitting on the front porch, as had become her habit, watching the stars emerge over the mountains and wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life or the smartest decision she'd ever make. "Kate," he said, settling into the chair beside her. The name sounded different when he said it now, not like he was humoring a lie, but like he was acknowledging who she'd chosen to become. "Luke." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that can exist between people who've shared real hardship and honest work. "I owe you an apology," Luke said finally. "What you did today, giving up all that money, I don't think I understood before how much this place, this life, really means to you." Katherine turned to look at him, seeing the man who'd rescued her from more than just a stagecoach accident, who'd shown her what it meant to earn respect, to build something with your own hands, to love someone not for what they could give you, but for who they chose to be. "Luke Harper," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I came west to escape who I was supposed to be, but I found something better. I found who I want to be, and that person, she's in love with you." Luke was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the starlight. "Kate Sullivan," he said finally, "if that's who you really are, then I love you too." Long pause, letting the moment settle like snow on the mountains. They were married in September, the same month Katherine was supposed to wed Reginald Pemberton III in New York. Instead of St. Patrick's Cathedral and 500 guests, They exchanged vows in the small church in town, with Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands as witnesses, and a potluck reception that lasted until dawn. Katherine never regretted her choice. She and Luke built the Harper Ranch into one of the most successful operations in Wyoming, combining her Eastern education with his Western practical knowledge. She used her understanding of finance and business to help other ranchers, becoming known throughout the territory as someone who could be trusted with both money and advice. More importantly, they built a love story that would inspire their children and grandchildren for generations. Not the kind of love that existed on paper, arranged by fathers and sealed with bank drafts, but the kind that chose itself, tested itself, and proved itself worthy through years of shared work and mutual respect. When Catherine Kate passed at the age of 79, her funeral was attended by half of Wyoming. She was mourned not as the heiress who'd given up her fortune, but as the woman who'd helped build a territory, one ranch and one act of kindness at a time. The words on her headstone were chosen by Luke, and they told her story better than any biography. She came west to find herself, and stayed to build a life. Katherine Sinclair to Kate Harper, the journey that matters. Final pause, like wind settling in canyon walls. Now, I've told you this story not because it's the most dramatic tale I know, though watching a New York heiress learn to brand cattle surely has its moments, but because it reminds us that sometimes the most important journey we make isn't across miles, but across the distance between who we're expected to be and who we choose to become. Sometimes wealth is about what you own, and sometimes it's about what you're willing to give up for love. Sometimes the richest person in the room is the one who's learned the difference between having everything and needing nothing more than what they've built with their own hands and heart. And sometimes, just sometimes, when you're brave enough to trade everything you've been given for everything you can earn, you discover that love isn't about what someone can do for you, but about who you become when you're with them. The West is full of stories about people who came looking for gold and silver, but this one's about a woman who found something more valuable than any precious metal. She found herself, and in finding herself, she found a love worth more than all the banks in New York. Trust me on that. I've seen what real wealth looks like, and it doesn't always come with a price tag.